What if the United States government paid off every single penny of its national debt? I mean, all of it, down to zero. It sounds like a total fantasy, right? A fiscal dream come true. But what would actually happen if we did it? Let's dive into this wild scenario and its seriously surprising consequences.
Believe it or not, this has actually happened once before. Yeah, really. Back in 1835, President Andrew Jackson, who absolutely hated national debt, somehow managed to bring the balance to zero. But here's the kicker. Instead of kicking off an era of amazing prosperity, it helped trigger a massive financial crisis, the Panic of 1837. Why? Because the nation's main safe asset just vanished. Talk about a lesson in unintended consequences.
So, that piece of history kind of looms over this whole discussion. It makes you wonder, right? What would happen if we, here in the 21st century, actually went on this colossal mission to pay off all our national debt? Well, the results might be way more complicated and, frankly, a lot weirder than you think. To figure out where we might be going, we first have to get a handle on how we got here. So let's wind the clock back about 30 years to a time that completely changed America's whole relationship with debt. The journey was, well, a complete roller coaster. The late 90s, if you can believe it, actually saw budget surpluses. We had the tech boom, the Cold War was over, things were looking pretty good. But then the 2000s hit. We had 9/11, two major wars, big tax cuts, and then of course the 2008 financial crisis, which just blew a giant hole in the budget that never really got stitched back up. The 2010s followed with sluggish growth and political gridlock, and then, just when you thought it couldn't get any crazier, COVID-19 arrived, and with it, trillions in stimulus spending. Each one of these events just piled more and more on. But it's not just the raw number that matters. It's the debt compared to the size of the entire US economy, the GDP. And this is where the story gets really dramatic. In 1995, our debt was about 64% of GDP. 15 years later, after a major crisis, it was still 64%. But in the next 15 years, it exploded, nearly doubling to 120%. That is an incredible, almost vertical acceleration. And that brings us to the number itself. By 2025, we're talking about an estimated $38 trillion. It's a figure so vast, it's kind of hard to even wrap your head around. But that's the mountain we are hypothetically setting out to climb. So how did that $38 trillion mountain get so big so fast? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was really four deep, powerful forces pushing it higher and higher. You had globalization shifting jobs. You had financialization making our economy way more complicated and risky. We have an aging population putting a huge strain on Social Security and Medicare. And on top of all that, deep political polarization made it nearly impossible to agree on how to fix any of it. So, what on earth could force a change? History tells us it's almost never a calm, rational decision. It's almost always a crisis. So let's just imagine a plausible breaking point, sometime in the 2030s. Okay, picture this. It's the early 2030s. A recession hits. At the exact same time, a new wave of inflation forces the Federal Reserve to crank up interest rates. Suddenly, the interest payments on that massive debt just balloon, eating up a completely unsustainable chunk of the federal budget. The system is officially broken. The status quo is no longer an option.
Now, out of this crisis, a new political reality could emerge. A bipartisan coalition forms, not because they want to, but because they have to. They hammer out something we'll call the Fiscal Responsibility Accord. And look, this isn't some sci-fi fantasy. It's modeled on real successful efforts in countries like Canada and Sweden back in the 90s, when they faced their own debt crises and managed to turn things around.
So how would this accord actually work? Well, it would stand on three critical pillars. First, debt stabilization. This means a mix of spending cuts and new revenue to run budget surpluses, not for a year or two, but for decades. Second, an intergenerational compact. You'd have to reform programs like Social Security and Medicare to make sure they'll still be there for younger generations. And third, a growth and equity package, making smart investments in our future paid for by a broader tax base, not by more borrowing. Okay, now for the really interesting part. Let's fast forward. Imagine the plan actually works. After decades of discipline, the US has almost paid off its entire debt. What does that world even look like? Well, it's not just one single future, but a few really fascinating possibilities. Two opposing futures come to mind right away. On one hand, you could have what we'll call disciplined prosperity. In this world, the tough lessons stick. the nation stays fiscally responsible, and new safe assets emerge to replace U.S. treasuries in the financial system. But then there's the rubber band effect. After decades of sacrifice, a new generation that never lived through the crisis sees a debt-free government and thinks, hey, party time. The hard-won discipline phrase, and the debt slowly creeps back up.
But this brings us to a third and maybe the most mind-bending scenario. What happens to the entire global financial system when its ultimate anchor, the U.S. Treasury bond, just vanishes? See, treasuries are seen as the safest investment on Earth. They're the benchmark for everything. Without them, you could see shortages of the collateral that's essential for lending markets. The U.S. dollar might lose some of its dominance, and the results? A more unstable, more volatile global market, sparking fierce political debates about whether the whole thing was even worth it.
So, when you put all these scenarios together, what's the most realistic takeaway from this whole thought experiment? What's the bottom line?
You know, the most likely future isn't a permanent state of zero debt. That's just not how political economies tend to work. Instead, the real legacy, the real prize from this multi-decade effort would be a nation that has relearned the tools and, more importantly, the political will for fiscal discipline. The achievement isn't the zero balance. It's the institutional memory you've built back. Ultimately, paying off the debt isn't like paying off a credit card. It's a monumental, generational project that would fundamentally reshape America's government, its role in the world, and the very architecture of our global financial system. It's a huge deal. Which really leaves us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? Is reaching that debt-free goal worth the decades of difficult choices and sacrifice it would demand? Or is the real problem not the debt itself, but the fact that we've simply forgotten how to use it as a smart, productive tool, and instead we've let it use us? That's something to think about.